Ben, thanks for being with us. All right, Ben, you have not shied away at times from being very critical of President Donald Trump. Let me ask you specifically, what do you think about his Middle East policy so far?
I mean, I think his Middle East policy has been quite good. I think that President Trump has responded quite correctly to the stupidity of the Obama policy that made Iran a regional player by strengthening the alliance between Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel, and his move to make Jerusalem the official capital of Israel, according to the United States, is one that will actually strengthen that alliance, not weaken it, because it actually takes the issue off the table for discussion. So I think that so far his Middle Eastern policy has been a hell of a lot better than I thought it would be when he was elected.
Ben, that being said, do you believe, though, it was a wise decision for Trump to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital at this time, even for him to say that the issue of Jerusalem was, quote, off the table for future negotiations? It did lead to violence here, as you know, in the Middle East, and there does seem to be that there's no clear policy moving forward.
I mean, there was no clear policy before, so I'm not really shocked that there is there's no clear policy now. I mean, the fact is you cannot negotiate with people who want to murder you, and the Palestinian Authority has been offered pieces of Jerusalem at least 2 times in the last 15 years. They've walked away from the table both times. So all of that was merely a ruse so that they could launch violence and complain about Israeli intransigence and all the rest of it. The fact is that Israel is not giving up the old city of Jerusalem. When Ehud Olmert offered to internationalize the old city of Jerusalem, Mahmoud Abbas didn't even come up with a counter offer. So I'm not sure exactly what anyone expects from Israel at this point, and I'm glad that Trump doesn't expect anything from Israel on this point either, because it would be stupid to do so.
So what do you make of the State Department's decision, though, to not say Jerusalem, Israel on official documents and maps, that there's no change in the passport policy at all?
Yeah, that's absurd. I have a niece who was born in Jerusalem, and her passport is just Jerusalem, not Jerusalem, Israel. That's ridiculous and insane. And I would hope that the Trump administration would do something about that and just order it. I mean, the State Department is part of the Trump administration. I would hope that they would order the State Department to simply start issuing those passports.
Ben, in some past articles and comments, you've been vocal about supporting population transfers. You once wrote in Town Hall, quote, if Israel is to exist, you must allow Israel to transfer the Palestinians and also Israeli Arabs from Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and even Israel proper. You're talking about the entire West Bank. Do you still believe that, and do you think it's a practical solution?
No, I wrote that column actually back when I was 19 years old, so that's not my current position on the issue. I've actually denounced my own position on the issue from back when I was 19. What I've suggested in my solution is that there is no long-term solution other than security, and that security is going to be reached simply by Israel annexing territory that it feels that it needs to maintain for its own security, and then protecting that area with its military. There is no long-term peace solution here because, again, Israel is facing down an implacable foe, and deporting millions of people from Judea and Samaria is not a practical solution or a moral one either.
Ben, Israel's current defense minister, very vocal about his support for land swaps. Many politicians, in fact, do advocate publicly for land swaps. What are your thoughts on land swaps? Do you think it's a good idea moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, land swaps are a different thing, right? There you're talking about Israel giving up certain lands in less populated areas in favor of areas that Israel has already cultivated and settled, right? Talking about making sure that Efrat remains part of Israel, obviously, and then giving up some land in another part of Israel to make up for that. I don't see what's implausible about that particularly, but I think that the entire process right now is implausible. The idea of giving up 1 inch of land to a terrorist regime, which is what the Palestinian Authority is, seems patently insane to me.
Ben, what would you tell President Trump right now, if he's watching right now? I mean, he said Jerusalem is Israel's capital. He said that he started the process of moving the embassy. But what specifically would you tell him he needs to do right now?
Well, I mean, I would move the embassy. I mean, not just say I'm going to move the embassy. I mean, like, actually rent a room and move the embassy there. It's not as though you need a huge space in order to make this happen. They should physically move it, because I fear that what will happen is Trump loses in 2020 and Democrats simply renege on the promise and don't move the embassy, and that leads toward more pressure for Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. I think that you have to materially make the change. Otherwise, there's always the possibility of reversal on that. As far as other moves in the region, I think that President Trump, again, providing more material support to Iranian protesters would be a solid move. I think, and I hope, that there's coordination between the Saudis and the Israelis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians about whatever military option needs to be taken with regard to stopping the Iranian nuclear program from moving forward.
Ben, as we talk, the Israeli government, they're working on a bill that could make it a lot easier for the death penalty to be enacted on convicted terrorists. There has been vocal opposition, even from within Israel's intelligence community, about how this legislation would impact the impact of it. What do you say about the death penalty bill here in Israel?
I think the death penalty bill should absolutely pass, and I think that they should apply the death penalty as frequently as possible against murderous terrorists who leave the blood of children outside Sparrow's restaurants. The idea that Israel allows these people to languish in prison just so that the Palestinian terrorists that Hamas can take prisoners, can go capture an Israeli soldier and then try and swap them out for a terrorist. It's bad policy. It's foolish.
Ben, before you mentioned Iran, I want to go back to that point. Do you think the president is doing enough? I mean, he tweeted support for the protesters. He didn't scrap the nuclear deal. Do you think he needs to do more on the ground beyond words at this time?
Well, he should certainly scrap the nuclear deal entirely. He sort of split the baby. He decertified the deal, but he didn't scrap the entire deal as it stands. He should just get rid of the deal entirely. The Congress should move to place new sanctions on the government of Iran. And then whatever covert aid they can afford to give to the people of Iran, they should absolutely give to the protesters in order to, with the full intent of toppling that regime. That regime needs to go.
Ben, in your view, why didn't more American Jews vote for Trump in 2016? And do you think that will change in 2020? Do you think that Trump's Jerusalem speech and other speeches are cultivating more support from American Jewish voters?
Well, I mean, it depends on why people vote. I don't think that a lot of American Jews vote based specifically on Israel. I think most American Jews are irreligious and don't care particularly much about Israel, or at least they care less about Israel than they do about abortion or same-sex marriage, for example. So, laying it all at the feet of Trump's Israel policy, I think, would be foolhardy. Also, Trump happens to be a particularly toxic persona, and his associations until late with people like Steve Bannon, who was friendly toward the alt-right, had driven a lot of Jews away from Trump. I think that disassociation will help Trump. I think that Trump's particular toxicity does not play well in sort of the white-collar Jewish communities and places in major cities around the country. That said, I think that its Israel policy is obviously going to be a draw for the Orthodox Jewish proportion of the United States. I would think the Orthodox Jews would vote very heavily for President Trump, as indeed they did in the last election cycle, but I think they would vote in even bigger numbers now that Trump has made clear his positions on Israel, which were really not all that clear before the election.
So what do you make about the close relationship, perhaps even on a personal level, between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the image of their friendship? What does it send around the world, or who does it help?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is smart to cultivate a personal relationship with President Trump. Trump seems to operate very much on the basis of personal friendship and personal relationship and warmth toward particular political figures. So it's smart of Netanyahu to do that. The idea that they're besties and they talk all the time, I'm not sure that that's particularly accurate, but they certainly have shared priorities, and I think that Netanyahu knows that, and I think that Trump understands that as well.
All right, two quick questions for you, Ben. First, what do you make of the latest round of news involving President Trump and a man that you know very well, Steve Bannon? What do you make of the public fallout between the two?
I think that Donald Trump has never made a smarter move than to not only get rid of Steve Bannon, but then to step on him. I think that Steve Bannon richly deserves it, was a negative force inside the administration, is a negative force for the president. And I think that his connections, as I've said before, with the alt-right and his sort of promulgation of their message was a huge mistake, not only for the administration, but for the right generally. So I'm very pleased that the President of the United States has realized and has spoken the truth of what I've been saying all along, which is that Steve Bannon is a self-aggrandizing con man who is only interested in arrogating power or the perception thereof to himself.
All right, Ben, we'll get you out of here on this last question. You made international headlines 2 weeks ago for a very public Twitter fight with Rosie O'Donnell. It got nasty very quickly, but it is the start of a new year. You're supposed to turn over a new leaf and all that. Any message of goodwill personally for you and Rosie O'Donnell?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say to Rosie O'Donnell is, Rosie, at least buy me dinner first. I mean, my goodness. She's being sexually harassed by Rosie O'Donnell was definitely not on my list of New Year's resolutions, so I would hope that that calms down.
All right, Ben Shapiro joining us. Thank you so much on Daily Dose.
Thanks so much.